The night Richard died, the house smelled of burnt cedarwood and winter rain. I can still taste that air if I close my eyes, the sharp bite of smoke from the fire that had burned too low in the hearth, the damp chill slipping in through the old window panes, the faint metallic tang of the oxygen machine humming beside our bed. It was a smell that clung to my hair for days afterward, like grief had its own perfume and wanted the world to know I wore it. I sat beside him for hours, tracing the veins on the back of his hand with the pad of my thumb. They looked like faded rivers on an old map, rivers that had carried me through every storm of my life. He had been my anchor when my mother disowned me, my shield when my first business failed, my one unwavering constant in a world that always seemed to shift beneath my feet. And now he was slipping away, grain by grain, like sand through a cracked hourglass. "Are you warm enough?" I whispered, though he hadn't opened his eyes in hours. His lips twitched, maybe a smile, maybe a reflex. I wanted to believe it was for me. Outside the window, snow drifted down like slow, deliberate confetti. The world had gone utterly still, as if time itself was holding its breath to witness this last chapter. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed, one of his nieces, perhaps, unaware or uncaring of how sound travels in a house this old. The sound pierced the quiet like a pin through silk. I wanted to shout, "How dare you laugh while he's leaving me?" But my voice stayed locked behind my teeth. When his breathing stopped, I didn't notice at first. The rhythm had grown so shallow, so thin, that silence felt like its natural extension. It was only when the machine stopped its steady wheeze that the world tilted beneath me. My own breath caught, then shattered into sobs. I remember clutching his wedding ring like it could anchor me to the earth. I pressed it into my palm until the metal bit my skin, until pain replaced the floating numbness. The house seemed to exhale all at once. Floorboards creaked. Radiators groaned. Downstairs, a door opened. Voices rose, muffled, conspiratorial. His family had been camped out here for days, filling the house like unwanted shadows, their disapproval a constant thrum beneath their forced politeness. They had never truly accepted me, not in 20 years. To them, I had always been the girl from nowhere who dared to love their golden boy. When I opened the bedroom door, they were waiting in the hallway like crows on a fence. His mother stood at the front, small and rigid, her silver hair pulled back so tightly it sharpened every bone in her face. "Is he?" she asked, her voice clipped, as though grief were an inconvenience she could schedule for later. I nodded. My throat felt raw. Something flickered across her face. Not sorrow. Not even shock. Something colder. She glanced at his brothers, and for a fleeting second, I could have sworn I saw relief. They filed past me without a word, a parade of black wool coats and unreadable eyes. I stood at the top of the stairs clutching the doorframe, trembling from more than just cold. They had come for the spectacle of his dying, I realized, not the grief of it. And now that it was done, their eyes had already shifted past him, to something else. I buried him 3 days later beneath a sky so white it hurt to look at. The funeral was a blur of black umbrellas and polite murmurs, the kind of performance grief that looks tidy in photographs. His mother wept without tears. His sister clutched my arms so hard I felt her nails through my coat, hissing through her teeth, "We'll sort everything soon." Sort what? I wanted to ask. The man was barely in the ground. That night, I returned to the house alone. Everyone else had scattered the moment the soil hit the coffin, like their duty was complete. The silence was unbearable. It rang in my ears like a held note. I wandered room to room, touching the things he'd touched, a book still open on his nightstand, his reading glasses folded neatly atop it, the dent in the pillow where his head had lain. The world felt hollowed out, as if his absence had carved a crater in the center of everything. I lit a fire in the hearth, but it only made the house feel colder, like the flames were painting shadows instead of warmth. At some point, I must have dozed off in his armchair. I woke to a sound. A faint creak. The unmistakable sigh of floorboards under weight. I held my breath. Then, voices. Whispering. From the kitchen. For one disoriented moment, I thought it was him, that death had been a cruel dream and he was downstairs making tea like he always did on sleepless nights. But the voices were sharper, hushed and hurried, like thieves arguing. I slipped off the chair and padded barefoot across the rug. The floor was icy under my feet. I stopped in the doorway to the dark hall and listened. Not fair, she doesn't deserve. He promised, all of us. Get the lawyer, contest it. My heart stuttered. They were still here. His family. Whispering in my kitchen about what was fair and what I did or didn't deserve. About lawyers. About promises. Their voices faded into silence again, followed by the soft click of the back door closing. I stood frozen in the dark for a long time, every muscle locked. It wasn't grief that held me still. It was the creeping realization that something had shifted. They weren't mourning him. They were circling me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, wrapped in his old cardigan, staring at the black window where my reflection hovered like a ghost. My mind ran in frantic loops. What promises? What did they mean, contest? Richard had mentioned nothing about a will, at least not to me. We'd always lived comfortably but quietly. He never flaunted wealth, never counted his worth in numbers. He'd been generous to his family, helping them through endless, bad investments and unexpected taxes. Could he have left them out? The thought curdled my stomach. By morning, the snow had stopped. The world outside looked scrubbed clean, innocent, as if nothing terrible had happened here at all. But inside, the air still felt thick with their voices, their contempt. I made tea, the way Richard used to, steeping the leaves until the water turned the color of rust. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. When the doorbell rang, I jumped, sloshing scalding tea across the counter. It was one of his brothers, David. Tall, neat, wearing an expression so calm it was almost cruel. He didn't offer condolences. Didn't even remove his gloves. The lawyer will be in touch, he said, like it was an appointment for pest control. There are matters to resolve. Matters? I repeated, my voice sounding far away. His mouth curved, not a smile, not exactly. You'll see. Then he left. Just like that. I stood there for a long time after the door clicked shut, tea cooling on the counter, heart beating a frantic rhythm in my chest. There was something in his tone, something that didn't belong in grief. Anticipation, maybe. Or threat. I told myself I was imagining it. That grief was twisting things. But deep down, I knew better. Something was coming. And I was alone. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to places where power is quietly measured. I had never been inside Mr. Calloway's office before, the family's lawyer for decades, a man with silver hair and glacier eyes who seemed carved from the same mahogany as his desk. The blinds were half drawn, filtering the January light into pale stripes across the table, and I remember thinking how it made the whole scene look like something out of an old photograph, frozen in time. They were already there when I arrived. Richard's brothers sat on one side like matching bookends, stiff-backed and silent, their dark suits still smelling faintly of church incense from the funeral. His sister, Mary Ann, perched between them, her lips pinched as though she'd tasted something sour. And at the head of the table, like the stem of a poisonous flower, sat their mother, Eleanor. Her hands were folded in her lap, gloved even indoors, her gaze cold enough to frost the windows. I could feel their eyes follow me as I took my seat at the far end of the table. My dress was still black, though I had swapped the funeral veil for something simpler. It didn't matter, their stares stripped me bare anyway. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat. Thank you for coming. I know this has been difficult. His voice carried no warmth. Let's just get on with it, David, the eldest brother, said. He tapped his pen against his notebook like a gavel. My hands were folded so tightly in my lap I could feel my nails biting crescents into my palms. I didn't expect anything. Truly, I didn't. Richard and I had shared everything during our years together, our laughter, our fears, the soft secret moments that belonged to no one else. Money had never been part of that language. I thought perhaps he'd leave me a small keepsake, something sentimental, like the cottage by the lake we once restored together, or maybe his collection of first-edition books. Mr. Calloway began reading. His voice was steady, practiced, but each word fell into the room like a pebble into still water. Bequests for charities. Donations to old family friends. A modest trust for his niece's education. Their faces were serene, expectant. And then, my name. I almost didn't catch it at first, the sound of it echoing strangely in this room where no one had spoken it since I walked in. And to my beloved wife. I sat a little straighter. My heart started to hammer, not with hope, but with something closer to dread. I bequeathed the entirety of my personal and liquid estate, valued at $30 million. Silence. It was the kind of silence that has edges, sharp and cutting. 30 million. The words seemed to ricochet around the room, slamming into the polished walls, into my ribcage. My ears rang. My breath stuttered. I gripped the arms of my chair to keep from swaying. Across the table, Marianne's mouth fell open. David's pen stilled mid-tap. The youngest brother, Thomas, let out a low whistle before catching his mother's glare and swallowing it back down. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply blinked once, slow and reptilian, before looking at me as though I had just crawled out of the floorboards. My voice broke. That can't be right. Mr. Calloway didn't even glance at me. It is what your husband instructed. In addition, the house and all associated properties are to remain solely in your name. Solely. The word struck like a bell. Their faces shifted all at once, like a flock of birds wheeling midair, shock, disbelief, then something darker, something that gleamed like a knife's edge. No, Marianne said, too sharply. No, you must be mistaken. I am not, Mr. Calloway said. He adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. Mr. Whitmore's instructions were explicit. Eleanor finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the room like a wire pulled taut. She must have influenced him. He wasn't thinking clearly at the end. I didn't know about this, I whispered. My hands trembled in my lap. I swear to you, I didn't. David slammed his palm against the table, the sound cracking like gunfire. Do you expect us to believe he just handed everything to you? I didn't ask for this. The words tore out before I could stop them. My throat burned. I loved him. That's all I ever wanted from him. Love, Eleanor said, the word curling from her mouth like smoke. Isn't that convenient? Her eyes locked onto mine, pale and glinting, and for the first time I understood why Richard had kept her at arm's length even in his final years. There was something bottomless in that gaze. Something that would hollow you out if you stared too long. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat again, perhaps to break the tension before it splintered the table. If there are no further questions, we can proceed with the formal. There are questions, David interrupted, voice low and dangerous now. Legal questions. Of course, Mr. Calloway said, unbothered. You are welcome to seek counsel. But Mr. Whitmore's will is binding. Binding. I could almost hear the word lodging like a bone in David's throat. They didn't look at me again when they left, not even to offer the brittle courtesy of goodbye. Chairs scraped. Coats snapped from hooks. The door shut hard enough to rattle the windows. I sat there long after they were gone, staring at the parchment in front of me as though it might vanish if I blinked. 30 million. A number so large it didn't feel real, like something from a life that wasn't mine. I thought of Richard's laugh, low and warm. The way he'd kissed my knuckles when I burned dinner. The way he had called me his home. And now he was gone. And I was rich. And they hated me for it. I pressed my palm flat on the table to steady my breathing. The surface was cold, unyielding. I wished desperately that he had told me. Warned me. That he had left me even one word to explain why he had chosen to light such a fuse beneath our already fragile peace. By the time I walked out into the pale winter afternoon, my legs felt hollow. The wind sliced through my coat as I crossed the parking lot, but I didn't pull the collar tighter. I needed to feel the cold, to anchor myself to something real. At home, the house loomed like a stranger. Too big. Too silent. The kind of silence that hums with unseen movement, like the moment before glass shatters. I tried to eat. I couldn't. I paced room to room, touching things just to remind myself they were still solid. As night fell, my phone began to ring. First Marianne. Then Thomas. Then an unknown number. I didn't answer. When the doorbell finally rang, sharp and relentless, I nearly screamed. Through the frosted glass, I saw David's silhouette, tall and still. I opened the door only halfway. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "We'll be contesting it," he said. My stomach dropped. "David. You don't deserve it." His voice was flat, devoid of heat, which somehow made it worse. "You were here for 20 years and never once understood who he really was. We built this family. We bled for it. You just married into it." "I loved him," I said, softly. His mouth twisted. "So did we. And he betrayed us." He turned and walked back down the steps, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there in the doorway until my feet went numb from the cold, listening to the empty road beyond the gate, to the echo of his words in my skull. Betrayed. As though Richard had wronged them by loving me. As though I had stolen something that had never belonged to them in the first place. When I finally closed the door, the house felt smaller somehow, the walls leaning in like watchful witnesses. I locked every bolt. Drew every curtain. Sat on the floor by the fire with Richard's ring clenched in my fist until the metal bit my skin. I thought the worst had already happened when death took him from me. But as I sat there in the flickering light, I understood. Death wasn't the end of this story. It was only the beginning of the war. They came for me quietly at first. It was in the small things, the kind of details only a grieving woman would notice because there was nothing else left to hold on to. One morning, I opened the kitchen cabinet where Richard used to keep the silver polish, and I found it gone. Not moved, not misplaced, gone. And then the family photographs that had once lined the upstairs hallway began disappearing one by one. His mother's lace-framed wedding portrait. His father shaking Richard's hand at his college graduation. All of it fading like a ghost erasing itself from the house. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief had made me suspicious. But then the bank cards began declining. I stood in line at the market holding nothing but milk, bread, and a bottle of Richard's favorite marmalade as the cashier's voice cut through the air. "I'm sorry, it's been declined." The man behind me cleared his throat impatiently. Someone laughed. And there I was, the widow of Richard Harrison, a man worth more than some small nations, fumbling for loose cash in my handbag like a schoolgirl who had forgotten her lunch money. When I got home, the driveway was empty. The gardener, who had tended the roses for 15 years, never showed again. The housekeeper sent a text, just one line: "I think it's better if I don't come anymore." No explanation. No goodbye. By the end of that week, I could feel the house turning hollow, like it had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Every sound echoed too loudly. My footsteps clicked on marble like they belonged to a stranger. Even the clock seemed to tick slower, dragging time out like a punishment. Then came the whispers. At the country club where Richard had once held court, they stopped meeting my eyes. I caught fragments as I passed, a woman lowering her sunglasses to murmur, she had him sign everything at the end, and another shaking her head, so sudden. He wasn't thinking clearly. I wanted to shout that I had begged him not to change the will, that I had pleaded with him through tears not to stir the old family resentments. But Richard had only smiled his stubborn smile and said, "They'll understand one day." They didn't. The first letter from the family's lawyers arrived on thick cream stationery, as if expensive paper could soften the poison it carried. They were deeply concerned, they wrote. Given the unusual nature of the revised will and Richard's compromised state of health in his final days, it is our responsibility to investigate the possibility of undue influence. Undue influence. The words curled like smoke through my head. They made it sound like I had slipped something into his tea, like I had crouched at his bedside whispering figures into his ear as he lay dying. As if love could be measured in clauses and signatures. Within weeks, the lawsuits began. One from his sister claiming I had alienated Richard from his true family. Another from a nephew alleging emotional distress. They filed motions to freeze the accounts, to contest the property deeds, to place the entire estate in temporary conservatorship until the matter was properly resolved. Which meant, of course, that I had access to nothing. I remember standing in the great room that evening, the one with the double-height ceiling and the stone fireplace Richard had been so proud of, and thinking how small I looked against it all. My reflection in the black glass of the unlit hearth was pale, unfamiliar. A guest. A trespasser. The silence of the house pressed in, thick and suffocating. I found myself talking aloud just to hear a human voice, though even my own words felt brittle, like they might crack if I said them too loud. "Richard," I whispered once into the stillness, "why did you leave me this burden?" But grief had no place to breathe anymore. It was drowned out by accusation, by headlines that called me the widow with 30 million, by glossy magazine covers showing my photograph from some charity gala years ago under captions like, "Beauty or Betrayal?" I stopped answering the phone. I stopped opening the curtains. I learned to live in the shadows, moving from room to room like a ghost who knew she didn't quite belong. It was in that stillness, though, that something inside me began to harden. Because if they wanted war, then I would become something they didn't expect. I started with the papers. Night after night, I sat at Richard's old mahogany desk, the surface cool beneath my forearms, and combed through every document he had ever signed. His will. His trusts. His business ledgers. There were decades of them, stacked in leather-bound boxes, the smell of ink and dust filling the study until it felt like breathing history itself. I read until my eyes blurred, until the words danced like moths on the page. I learned the language of clauses and contingencies, of codicils and probate law. I found loopholes and ironclad provisions, hidden like jewels between lines of legal jargon. And slowly, I began to see Richard's mind again, the way he'd arranged everything with meticulous care, anticipating their every move. He had known this war would come. He had left me not just wealth, but weapons. I also began to gather whispers of my own. The same friends who had drifted from me started returning Richard's family's calls. Champagne-laced voices on speakerphone, careless laughter spilling secrets. I sat in the dark at the edge of the room, listening. Taking notes. Remembering who owed what to whom. Which nephew had quietly mortgaged his vineyard. Which sister had forged signatures to keep her gallery afloat. Which cousin had buried a scandal so deep it could ruin them all if it surfaced. I told no one what I knew. Not yet. I simply smiled when their lawyers called, when their demands arrived in thick envelopes tied with silk ribbons like presents laced with arsenic. I made tea. I kept the garden alive myself, kneeling in the damp earth until my knees ached, hands deep in soil while upstairs the fax machine whirred out new accusations every hour. They thought they were breaking me. But every wound only carved something harder into my bones. Sometimes at night, I wandered the halls barefoot, running my fingertips over the wallpaper like I could feel Richard in the walls. He had built this place for us, a fortress, he called it, where nothing could touch what we had. Now it felt like the fortress had turned against me, its very stones siding with the enemy. And yet, I stayed. Because beneath the grief, beneath the anger, something else had begun to bloom. Something sharp and quiet and patient. I was no longer just surviving. I was waiting. Waiting for the moment when the cracks they had carved into my life would split open wide enough for me to step through, not as their victim, but as something they would never see coming. And that moment was closer than they knew. Because one night, while sorting through Richard's safe for the 1000th time, I found an envelope I had somehow overlooked, tucked flat against the back panel, sealed with his handwriting scrawled across it like a whisper meant only for me. It said just 3 words. For when they come. And inside. I found the chest on a rainy Thursday afternoon, though I'm still not sure if it found me first. The storm had rolled in without warning, dark clouds pressing low against the windows until the house seemed swallowed by shadow. I hadn't meant to go into Richard's study that day. I had avoided it for weeks. The scent of his cologne still clung to the air there, and his leather chair remained tucked neatly beneath the desk as though he might stroll back in, brushing rain from his shoulders and scolding me for sitting in his seat. But something drew me there, something more insistent than grief. Perhaps it was the thunder rattling the window panes, or perhaps it was the silence in my chest, the kind that grows too heavy to carry. The study was cold when I entered, colder than the rest of the house, like it had been holding its breath. Dust floated in lazy spirals where the gray light cut across the room. The books lining the shelves stared back like sentries, untouched since the day Richard died. And then, tucked behind the lower shelf of law volumes, I saw the edge of the chest. It was small enough to be hidden in the shadows, but not small enough to be forgotten. Brass corners dulled with age. A lock the color of tarnished bone. My pulse quickened. I knelt on the rug and pulled it free, the scrape of wood on wood loud in the quiet room. The chest was heavier than I expected. When I tugged at the lid, it refused to budge. The lock, though old, was still firm. I searched for the key. It wasn't in the desk drawers, nor behind the framed photographs, nor tucked in the hollowed-out dictionary where Richard used to hide birthday cards. I was about to give up when my eyes landed on his navy blazer, still hanging in the wardrobe like he'd only just taken it off. I ran my hand along the inside lining, and felt it. A small bulge stitched into the seam. My fingers trembled as I pulled it loose. A key. Simple. Brass. Cold against my palm. It fit perfectly into the lock. The chest opened with a sigh. Inside lay bundles of envelopes tied with twine, leather-bound journals, and several manila folders marked with dates and names. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something older, like time itself had been folded and kept safe inside. At the very top was an envelope addressed in his handwriting. To Eleanor. For when they come. My heart stuttered. I carried the envelope to the desk and sat down, the chair creaking beneath my weight. The storm outside crackled like distant applause as I broke the seal. His handwriting slanted across the page with its usual quiet precision. My darling Eleanor. If you are reading this, I am gone, and they have begun their war. I have known it would come. I have known it for years, though I did not tell you, because I wanted our time to be untouched by their poison. I did not leave you this fortune because of duty, nor pity, nor the hollow customs they worship. I left it to you because you are the only soul who stood by me when the world saw only what they could take. You never wanted what I had. You wanted only me. And that is why you must keep it. Because they will try to destroy you for it. They will say you tricked me. They will say you were unworthy. But I have kept everything they thought I did not see. You will find it here. Use it if you must. They will call you a thief. Let them. You are my heir in the only way that matters, in loyalty. Richard. My hands were shaking when I finished. I pressed the paper to my chest as if it could steady my heartbeat. Loyalty. That was why. Not romance. Not charity. Not guilt. Loyalty. Tears blurred the edges of the page as I reached back into the chest. The journals were worn soft at the corners. The leather spines cracked when I opened them, revealing decades of Richard's neat script, business meetings, personal musings, private observations that read more like confessions than notes. And then the names. His brother, his sister, his mother. Pages filled with dates, figures, and incidents, quiet embezzlements buried in accounting ledgers, affairs hushed with discreet payoffs, charitable trusts siphoned into personal accounts. He had recorded everything, not out of malice, but like a man collecting seeds before a famine. I flipped through the folders next. Signed statements from former employees, affidavits, photocopies of checks bearing signatures that weren't theirs. It was all there. Years of their betrayals, meticulously documented, catalogued, sealed away. They thought they knew Richard. They never did. And neither, I realized, had I. Not fully. Because beneath his tenderness there had always been steel, and he had wielded it silently, waiting for the day it would be needed. Waiting for me to find it. A soft thud broke my trance. One of the smaller envelopes had slipped to the floor. I picked it up and saw my name on the front. The date beneath it chilled me. It had been written 3 months before his death. I opened it with numb fingers. Eleanor. I see the fear in your eyes sometimes, though you try to hide it from me. The way you glance at my family across the table as if they are wolves circling. You are not wrong. They will bare their teeth the moment my back is turned. It is who they are. But I have made peace with it, because I have made preparations. And I need you to trust me, even when it feels impossible. This wealth is not a gift. It is a shield. It is the only way to keep you standing when they try to burn the ground beneath your feet. They will come for you, my love. And when they do, you must not run. You must stand. R. I sat there for a long time with the letter clutched in my lap. The rain drummed harder against the windows. Lightning split the sky outside, illuminating the study in a flash so bright it seared the edges of everything. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a battlefield. And Richard had left me armed. I leaned back in his chair and stared up at the ceiling until the tears slid silently into my hair. He had loved me, not in the fragile, fleeting way they claimed, but with the ferocity of someone who had decided I was worth protecting, even from beyond the grave. And for the first time since his death, I no longer felt like prey. I stayed in the study until night swallowed the house whole. One by one, I placed the letters and documents back into the chest, locking it tight. Then I hid the key in the seam of my own coat, just as he had hidden it in his. As I left the room, the storm finally broke apart, retreating into a hush so complete it felt like the house was exhaling. But in the silence, I could feel it, something inside me shifting. Hardening. They thought they were fighting for money. They had no idea what I was about to become. Because tucked inside one of those folders, beneath the betrayals and the bribes, was something else entirely. Something with a name on it I had never expected to see. A name that did not belong to them. But to me. I never planned to become the villain they whispered about. In those first hollow months after Richard's death, I only wanted peace, just enough quiet to hear my own thoughts again. But peace is a fragile thing, and they were relentless. His family flooded the courts with accusations, poisoned the air with their gossip, turned friends into strangers with a few carefully seeded lies. And I let them. I sat in those echoing courtrooms, spine straight, hands folded in my lap, while their voices rose like the hiss of snakes. I wore the black dress Richard had always loved on me, and around my neck, the string of soft cream pearls he had given me on our 10th anniversary. I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. Not yet. Because I had learned something grief had taught me without meaning to: silence is its own kind of weapon. While they performed their outrage, I listened. Every barb they threw, every timeline they twisted, every forged detail they presented, I collected them like fallen leaves, tucking them into the quiet corners of my mind. And then, when no one was looking, I began. I started with Richard's journals, the ones from the chest hidden in his study. Night after night, I sat at his old oak desk, reading by the soft cone of the lamp while the house around me exhaled its loneliness. His handwriting became my anchor, the sharp angles of his letters, the faint indentation where his pen pressed harder on certain names. The names mattered. His brother, Henry, who had always draped himself in piety like a cloak, had siphoned money from Richard's trust decades ago, disguising it as overhead on a development project that never broke ground. His sister Margaret, so quick to cry on cue in the courtroom, had been quietly selling off family art pieces under forged provenance papers. Even his mother, Ruth, stern, regal, and cold as marble, had taken loans against the family foundation's endowment to fund her secret gambling debts. Richard had recorded it all. And now, so would I. I hired my first investigator in secret. A man named Lowell, gray-haired, soft-spoken, the kind of person who could walk through a room without being seen. I gave him only what he needed, and he gave me more than I expected. Within weeks, he returned with documents, bank statements, silent witnesses willing to talk when no one knew they were talking. I listened to their stories late into the night, the phone warm against my ear, the rain tapping at the window as though the house itself was eavesdropping. Each revelation was another stitch in the net I was quietly weaving. Henry's charity had been under federal investigation for tax fraud, buried quietly when a bribe changed hands. Margaret's secret account in the Cayman Islands. Ruth's false medical claim to liquidate Richard's life insurance just days after his funeral. They thought they were hunting me. They had no idea I was already dismantling the ground beneath them. The first time I revealed something, it was almost accidental. Henry's lawyer had been cornering me in court, painting me as a conniving widow who had isolated Richard from his family. His voice rang like the clatter of knives across the table, loud enough that even the judge flinched. I didn't raise my voice. I simply slid a manila folder across the table to my attorney. Inside were 3 pages, wire transfers, signed affidavits, and a notarized letter from Richard's former accountant. Henry's lawyer stopped mid-sentence. The color drained from his face. They called for a recess. Henry never returned to the stand. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching snow dissolve against the glass. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strange, hollow calm that comes when you realize the tide has turned and you're the one quietly steering it. After that, the rhythm changed. I didn't chase them. I didn't argue. I let them burn themselves on their own matches while I nudged the flames toward the right kindling. Margaret was next. She had always been the dramatic one, painting herself as the grieving sister wronged by a scheming interloper. I let her monologues go on for days, until Lowell placed a single photograph on my desk. It showed her at a Paris auction house 2 weeks after Richard's death, selling one of the family's heirloom paintings under an alias. I said nothing in court. I didn't have to. My attorney handed the photo to the judge, along with the shipping records that traced the painting from our estate to her secret storage unit. Margaret's scream echoed off the marble columns as she fled the room. Ruth tried to rally them after that. She came to the house unannounced one afternoon, wrapped in her fox fur stole despite the spring warmth, her perfume preceding her like an army. She stood in the doorway of Richard's study and said, "You can't win, Eleanor. We will bury you." I met her eyes. Calm. Still. "You already tried," I said softly. "And you missed." She left without another word. The lawsuits began to falter soon after. Judges dismissed motions. Witnesses recanted statements they had sworn to only weeks earlier. Henry stopped showing up to hearings altogether. Margaret fired her attorney. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. Because somewhere along the way, survival had sharpened into something colder. I had thought of this as defending myself, but defense doesn't require precision. This was something else. This was methodical. Surgical. The part of me that had once begged them to see me as family was gone, and in her place stood someone who had stopped asking for permission to exist. I realized it fully on the day Henry's charity was exposed in the press. The headlines used words like fraud and federal inquiry and pending charges. Cameras camped outside his office while he slipped out the back door like a rat abandoning its sinking ship. I watched the broadcast from Richard's armchair, my legs tucked beneath me, sipping tea that had long gone cold. I didn't smile. I just exhaled. They had wanted to erase me. Instead, they had erased themselves. By summer, the will contests were gone. Dismissed. Eradicated. The fortune was indisputably mine. The family name, once polished like crystal, was cracked and hollow. They barely spoke to each other anymore. When they did, it was in hissed accusations over who had let me win, who had failed to contain me. They never understood that they had never truly seen me at all. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness. They would never make that mistake again. I could have stopped then. I should have. That would have been the merciful thing, the human thing. But mercy is a language you forget when you've been hunted for too long. And there was still one folder I hadn't opened. It had been buried at the bottom of Richard's chest, beneath all the journals and letters, wrapped in plain brown paper. I had touched it many times but never undone the string. Perhaps some part of me had known what waited inside, and what it might turn me into if I saw it. I opened it on a quiet August night, alone in the cavernous house, the cicadas singing their ancient dirges outside the windows. The air smelled of old wood and faint lavender from the sachets I tucked into the curtains. Inside were only a few pages. And on the first one, a name. Not theirs. Mine. A deed. A company registration. And beneath it, a signature. Richard's. I stared at it until the words blurred and the room seemed to tilt sideways. My breath came shallow, fragile, as though even the air around me had shifted. He had left me more than the fortune. He had left me something that would make the fortune look like pocket change. Something they didn't know existed. Something they could never take back. And as the cicadas wailed into the dark, I felt the last soft part of me curl away like scorched paper. Because I knew what I was going to do next. And they would never see it coming. The house no longer echoes the way it once did. A year has passed, though sometimes it still feels like winter lingers in the corners, like frost clinging to the bones of the place. Yet when I walk down the grand staircase each morning, sunlight spills across the marble, warm and soft as honey, and I think, maybe I survived it. Maybe I've done more than survive. I named it the Winter House. It seemed fitting, somehow, like naming the storm you've lived through just to prove it didn't take you. The lawyers are gone now, their letters stopped arriving months ago. The newspapers stopped caring about the woman who stole an empire, and then quietly disappeared behind her iron gates. What they don't know is that I opened those gates. Not for them, but for women like me. At first, they came one at a time. A young woman with a bruise fading along her jaw. An older one who had nothing but a suitcase and the kind of silence that makes your heart ache. They stood on my porch like I once stood in this world, unsure, unwanted, and unbearably tired. I gave them keys. Now, laughter threads through the hallways where whispers used to rot. There are vegetable gardens behind the east wing, rows of green beans and tomatoes rising from soil that was once hard as stone. I planted roses along the fence line, pale pink ones because Richard always said they reminded him of the first dress I wore to dinner. I told him once that roses seemed too delicate for me. He smiled and said, "Delicate things are the ones worth defending." I think of that often. There's a bench by the koi pond where I drink my morning tea. Sometimes one of the women joins me, and we sit in easy quiet, listening to the soft trickle of water. They ask me how I did it, how I endured the years of venom and shadow and came out whole. I tell them the truth, I didn't. I came out in pieces. But piece by piece, I learned how to place myself back together in ways that were stronger, sharper, truer than before. I don't tell them about the nights I still wake gasping, hearing the gavel slam like a gunshot in my dreams. Or how sometimes I walk past Richard's study and still expect to hear the scrape of his pen, the faint hum of his voice murmuring figures to himself. Healing doesn't erase ghosts. It just teaches you how to live alongside them without flinching. On Sundays, I drive to the cemetery. It's always quiet there, the air tasting faintly of rain even on sunny days. I sit by his grave and tell him about the roses. About how the koi have grown fat and lazy. About how the women laugh now, real belly-deep laughter, not the brittle kind people use to hide their fear. I tell him I hope he'd be proud. Sometimes I swear I feel him there, like the warmth of a hand hovering just above my shoulder. He would have loved this, turning grief into something that grows. He believed in redemption, though he rarely said the word aloud. He simply built his life around it, and somehow he left me the bricks to do the same. It's strange, how quiet strength looks from the outside. The world called me ruthless once. I let them. They needed a villain, and I was convenient. But the truth is far more ordinary. I survived because I refused to vanish. I endured because I could not bear the thought of my love for him dissolving into their lies. And somewhere along the way, I realized I was no longer fighting them. I was simply building something they could never touch. Some evenings, when the house is still and the women are asleep, I walk through the rooms and run my fingers along the walls. I think about the version of myself who once curled on the cold floor here, drowning in grief and fury. I want to tell her that she was right to hold on. That love, real love, can outlast even the ugliest storms. They don't come for me anymore. Not the family, not their lawyers, not the gossips with their knives disguised as smiles. They tore themselves apart long ago. I suppose that's its own kind of justice, though it no longer matters to me. Their downfall was never the point. It only cleared the ground so something new could grow. And it has. The winter house hums with life now. We cook together in the old kitchen, the same one where I once sat alone at midnight, listening to my own heartbeat echo. The air smells of garlic and rosemary and fresh bread. Someone always leaves wildflowers in a chipped vase on the counter. There's music on the record player, soft and crackling, like laughter from another lifetime finding its way back to me. I keep Richard's photograph on the mantel. Not the formal portrait from the newspapers, the one where his mouth is pressed into a polite, cold line. No, I keep the one I took in the garden, years ago, when he wasn't looking. His hair is mussed by the wind, and he's half smiling at something out of frame. That's how I like to remember him, not as the empire they fought over, but as the man who loved me enough to leave me the tools to rebuild. There are still moments when loneliness sneaks in like a draft through old windows. When I lie awake and reach for him across the sheets, forgetting for a heartbeat that he's gone. But the ache is softer now. It's laced with gratitude. I had him. For a time, he was mine, and that will always be enough. Sometimes I catch my reflection in the glass doors of the solarium and don't recognize myself. Not the girl they once mocked. Not the widow they tried to destroy. Just a woman who lived through the fire and chose to plant roses in the ashes. The fortune didn't save me. It was never meant to. Love did. And though they may never forgive me, I no longer need them to. I forgave myself. I whisper it to the roses when I water them in the early light, dew clinging to their petals like tiny diamonds. I whisper it to the koi as they ripple the pond in slow, golden arcs. I whisper it to the ghosts of this house until they soften into nothing more than memories. Spring lives here now. Still, some nights when the wind rattles the old windows, I swear I hear footsteps in the east wing, soft, deliberate, lingering, like someone is still walking these halls, waiting for me to find what they left behind. And deep down, I know. I will. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own journey, the battles you've fought quietly, the gardens you've planted in places once filled with ruin. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that healing is possible, even after devastation. Leave your thoughts in the comments, I would love to hear your story too. And if you want to walk beside me as I share more tales of resilience, loss, and rebirth, make sure to subscribe. Together, we'll keep finding spring on the other side.